issues that sometimes dog science is this idea of ethics. And it's a really important thing because ethics can often determine whether people will accept an idea or not. And it's also important that countries, international cooperatives also regulate these things to ensure that when a scientific idea comes, it's going to be accepted and that there as well. And of course, there are some people who will sort of follow this motto there that, if there's no one to see you, nothing's illegal. And of course, ethics. If you look at it as a definition, it's about morality, and it's also thinking about how a decision or an event will impact people's lives. And this idea of what's good for individuals, what's good for society. And this idea that, when you talk about things like vaccines, so a lot of debate has happened about COVID vaccines and vaccines in general. And the idea that, it's good for the individual to get a vaccine because they won't get sick, but it's also good for society for people to do that because things like health systems won't be overrun with sick people from preventable diseases. And the idea that the needs of the many, the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The idea that society benefits if individuals make good decisions. But again, that can be countermanded by the idea of, individual freedom, particularly in hardcore capitalist societies like the United States, where it's often the individual rights supersede the rights of the entire population. And of course, in Australia, we'd see that as well. But there's also been some historical cases, things like the use of radiation. And people wouldn't necessarily know about this, but places like the United States did a huge number of experiments on the effect of radiation on people, often on their own citizens. And so generally it was things like people who were poor, sick or powerless. So there used to be institutions which would hold things like orphanages for abandoned children, particularly those that were born with things like Down syndrome or disability. And a lot of experiments were done on those children just to see the effects. Things there like prison inmates and things like that. And these are things that most people would say are bad. To deliberately infect or expose someone to radiation is not good. Now, of course, pharmaceutical research often does a similar thing. And, companies will do things. They'll go to poor countries. So Uganda is not a very wealthy country. And so what you've got there as well is companies will come in and test drugs. And here is a drug that was HIV prevention. And of course, on the surface, you think, that's really bad that they're going into a poor country. But you can also look at the other side, is that Uganda, like a lot of African countries, has a huge problem with HIV. And so if this company can come in and test the drug there, and some mothers, some children are prevented from getting HIV, is that a bad thing? And again, this is where ethical frameworks have to be developed, because otherwise it's not a cut and dried issue. There's good and bad. And I think it's got to be important that people look about the idea. And in this case here, there wasn't really informed consent. So if a mother went into this trial and said, I know I've got HIV, but this may prevent my baby getting it, then that may be good. Also, in the United States, they've done experiments on foster care children, children living in orphanages and things like that. And those are the sorts of things that people would generally say, no, we don't want to be part of. But again, when the government actually has guardianship over these children, they can unfortunately do some very unfortunate things. Of course, we have the example of this scientist here who claimed to have made a CRISPR baby and was sentenced to jail there. And this idea of, is it ethical to manipulate genes in embryos? Is it right to be able to do that? And it often gets mentioned, the idea that, if CRISPR can allow babies to have certain attributes, does that mean only the people who can afford the treatments are going to get them? Is there going to be a two-tiered society? And this whole bioethical argument there's no right or wrong. It's complex. If we genetically modify organisms, is that good? And you can make the argument that farmyard animals, the pig, cow, sheep, goats, whatever, chickens, they've all been genetically modified. Those animals do not exist in that way in nature. We've just done that over generations. We've done that through selective breeding. But CRISPR technology is getting to that same point. It's just doing it a lot faster. And so biotechnology, nanotechnology, bioethics, when it comes to euthanasia. If someone is dying of terminal cancer and they are near the end of their life, is it ethical to keep them alive so that they're going to suffer? Things like organ trafficking, can people pass them on there? Do people know what they're getting into with therapeutic trials? And you can just go on and on there. And this is bio trials, anything to do with biology in the modern world often has to take in the ethical. Now again, moving away from the bioethics side of it, Australia in particular has made a lot of money in the last century digging stuff out of the ground. And that is changing a little bit, but the Mining Act of 1971 regulates how people in Australia can actually go ahead with this here. And so in terms of native title, the government and any company needs to negotiate with the Indigenous landholders and make sure that if stuff has been taken from the land, people will actually get a benefit from that. And there have been cases where the traditional owners have said, yep, we're happy with that. We're happy to take some payment for this and that there. And a lot of this does come about because up until a while ago, mining practices did not need to actually take into account the environment. So in places like Tasmania, there are lakes which are huge amounts of contaminants. There's places in Tasmania where plants won't grow, and that's repeated across the world. And unfortunately, in places like third world countries, those regulations aren't very strong. But when you look at the way mining has to happen now, usually an environmental impact statement needs to be done. And so there's a lot of work that has to go in beforehand. So mining companies have to even before they've started digging anything out of the ground, have to consider rehabilitation. So when the life of the mine ends, how are they going to ensure that there's a natural process of getting the mine back to almost what it was before? And so, there's a lot of environmental studies. The financial options are a massive thing as well. If a mine has a life of 20 years, will it still be financially viable at the end there? And during the mining, the areas can be reclaimed. So if mining processes move from one place to another, then the rehabilitation process can start there as well. There also have to be things like ensuring that there's no disturbance of lands. In the southwest of Sydney, and in the Wollongong and Illawarra area, there's a lot of coal mining. And there's been issues there where things like Thirlmere Lakes have had issues where the groundwater has disappeared. Also in Australia, you have to consider now climate change impacts. And that's a really important thing as well, because internationally, a lot of the major banks and a lot of the major lenders are moving away from things like coal mining because they can see that business-wise, that's going to be a problem in the future. And again, making sure that there's no ongoing impacts. So in some mining cases there, if they're transporting material, that material might be damp to ensure that there's no dust coming off. Another really important thing there is, of course, the water impact there, because as I briefly mentioned before, if you're breaking apart the ground, are you destroying aquifers? Are you destroying areas in the ground where groundwater is stored? And if that groundwater is lost, is that a resource that's going to be lost to future generations as well? And of course, once the mine has finished, then there needs to be a process to ensure that you just don't have a giant hole in the ground, and that some of, if not all of, the natural environment that was there beforehand can actually be returned. And can the indigenous culture then come in and be part of that as well? Can the land be reused? Is it usable for farmland? A lot of companies in Australia are looking at the idea of converting some of their old areas into solar farms, wind farms. And finally, this idea of bioprospecting. Now, it's quite a common thing that's happened in the past. And again, going back to this idea of intellectual property, and that in Australia, the indigenous population, they own the rights to their cultural and intellectual property. And that if someone is going to come in and use that for some reason, the indigenous people should get some form of compensation. And so this idea of bioprospecting, where you take a idea or you take a plant, you can take some material, genetic or otherwise, and use that to create a new product, whether that's a new treatment, whether that's something like a cosmetic or something or a food source. The main thing is that bioprospecting means that also people get a benefit, and particularly the indigenous people.